Let's talk about Castleview by Gene Wolfe. This is a standalone fantasy novel by Gene Wolfe, a big author I cover on this channel. It's a sort of Arthurian urban fantasy. I'll read the back. Will Shields was not a fanciful man, new owner of the town's main auto dealership, not the sort of man to imagine the castle he saw from the attic window, turrets and towers sort of shimmering on the horizon, and his cookbook-writing wife, Anne, feet firmly on the ground, even when driving and nearly running down the giant horseman who loomed out of the dark. Consider also their daughter Mercedes, more worried about those extra teenage pounds than the strange lady in white who seemed to be hitching a ride. But then no one could reasonably expect the Arthurian legends to come to life in a quite ordinary town not 100 miles from Chicago. And the Locust review is kind of interesting. Imagine Tennyson's Idylls of the King, run through at triple time, directed by Howard Hawks and starring Jimmy Stewart, Jean Arthur and Astor. You'll begin to get a sense of the book. So it's an urban fantasy. It's set in Castleview, Illinois. It's from the same period as his other urban fantasies, other urban stories. So Live Free, Live Free, Live, and There Are Doors is a similar period, which isn't an urban fantasy, and Pandora by Holly Hollander, which is a straight non-fantasy murder mystery. And like Pandora particularly, it's very notably near Chicago, where he was from. It's his home, and it's his people. It's got a nice cover, actually. I don't know how much this has been reprinted or not. I mean, I got this fairly cheaply on eBay. Obviously, very much secondhand. This is a 92 New English Library paperback edition, and it's published in Britain, 91, as a hardback. Originally 1990. But yeah, it's a kind of nice, decent cover image. With this sense of the fading worlds together. It's good. I think here's some comparisons, and it's relevant that these comparisons are chiefly British. And I say it's relevant these comparisons are chiefly British because when I look at reviews, there are some strengths and some weaknesses which I want to get onto. But when I look at reviews, sometimes I think I get a sense from these reviews, you've got people who don't really get the mythic substratum, and I don't mean they don't know all their Arthurian stories, their Mallory and their Tennyson. What I mean is they're not in the tradition of British literature. So here is books that are very close to it in terms of worlds merging or bleeding into each other, the matter of Britain and British legend, Mythico Wood, Lavondis, etc., by Robert Holdstock, Elidor by Alan Garner, The Dark is Rising cycle, which I've reviewed on this, by Susan Cooper. Place of the Lion by Charles Williams, who certainly also touched on some of the themes in his Taliesin poems. That Hideous Strength, particularly, by C.S. Lewis. And it's not dissimilar to fairy story boundary tales, like, and in fact, in terms of the bleed, it's definitely also like The Magician's Nephew, but in general, like Narnia by C.S. Lewis, Neverwhere and Stardust by Neil Gaiman, and the graphic novel A Game of You, which is number 5 in the Sandman series, or is number 4? And King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. It's in a tradition that is broadly British. It's not only, I think I did have, and I'm afraid it's gone from my mind, an American author in mind who I think has done something similar. And of course there are American urban fantasies. Urban fantasy is originally an American genre, I think, chiefly. But this thing about particularly the water is a major theme here, and the filmy layer between our world and fairy. And I think that's something which fits into a particularly strong British stream. I talked about some of this a little bit in a video I made a couple of years ago about British and American fantasy. And there is a haunting in Britain, or of Britain, by these tales. and I think that might not always translate one for one to an American reader or to a whoever else reader. I think it's interesting. American Gods by Neil Gaiman is not the same kind of bleed story. There is not this other world in the same way, but it precisely tries to discuss some of those questions, doesn't it? But yeah, what's going on? Basically, you've got increasingly strange events on this wet and wild night. It happens basically within 24 hours. It starts with a murder, literally, in the first half page. It seems like a guy called Tom Howard has died, seemingly killed. And then this new family who's coming to town, the Shields, they're looking at Tom Howard's house. And there's lots of other people they come into contact with. And Will Shields wants to find out about the town and understand it. And just events escalate in a very weird and Wolfian way, in a sense. It's third person limited, which is an interesting choice for Wolfe, because it means you don't have, which is classic for Wolfe, a strange, potentially unreliable first person narrator like Severian or Holly Hollander, very obvious examples. So Book of the New Sun and Pandora respectively. There are other examples too in Wolfe. He's a big fan of that, but here it's third person, and that means that I think it is presented in a slightly different way. It's limited. Characters don't have universal perspectives. They don't know what's happening, and a lot is made of that. But the fact that reportage is trustworthy allows us to make judgments about, even though sometimes it's only from their perception, the character's perception, us to make different judgments about what's going on. And there's this increasingly dramatic plot. Just things are happening, stuff is cropping up, you don't get it, and it gets increasingly strange and wonderful as you go. And this is, I think, incredibly effective, incredibly well written. It's fascinatingly written for a Wolfe book. It is incredibly simply written. I don't mean it's always simple words or simple sentence structures, but I mean it's basically relatively simple for him. And the pacing is, for Wolfe, at an absolute breakneck speed for him. It is a page turner. A common thing is a chapter. Within a chapter, you might go between perspectives, but at the end of a chapter, you might have a cliffhanger that is not picked up in the next chapter. It may happen later. It may happen later in the chapter. It may happen 2 chapters' time. And that is unusual for Wolfe in terms of the idea that something confusing happens at the end of a chapter is incredibly common for Wolfe, but that specifically it happens in this quite thrillerish way is quite rare within the Wolfe I've read, which is about half his novels. So it reads as a popular book, and though again you'll read some reviews where people say it's simply baffling, including people who like Wolfe, the main stuff that's happening isn't all super baffling. Much of it is pretty straightforward. By that I mean some basic facts of the plot, the basic encounters and events, and many of the tensions involved. You don't need either nuclear physics to work out how everything sticks together, nor a PhD in Arthurian literature to get the references. And if you don't get the references, you keep reading. There are some very odd things going on. There are some real mysteries. Mark Aramini does talk quite helpfully about some of these in literary detail in his second essay collection, Between Time and Something, which I recently got, which I've really enjoyed reading about Castleview in there. There's some odd things, including potential genre bending and questions of time and space, and how the other world that exists merges in. But that stuff, that's all secondary. You can enjoy the main story much like you can enjoy many of his other novels just by reading it and just getting what you can out of it the first time without worrying about all the mysteries. It has a really interesting wide range of characters who tend to have a distinctive trait or two, tend to have a particular thing they're offering, and they fit within a Wolfian canon of characters. They're enjoyable and fun, and there's some funny lines. There's some profoundly sweet and powerful moments between characters of all different kinds, romantic and friendship and so on. There's some fascinating character ambiguities, particularly, well, not particularly, but like in both sets of characters, because you have characters who seem to be associated with the other world, and you have characters, just who are human, and you get some fascinating ambiguities in each set, and there's certainly something there which I need to reflect on more, which I think is at least partly thinking about the nature of humanity. I think the way it addresses the Arthur myths is fascinating and great, with just some there's some stuff that recently, having read The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, which is a single short story, having recently read that for the first time by him, which is very early. It's about the earliest one he had collected. In his first collection of short stories, it's the first story, and there's a line in there essentially about the recurrence of the heroic story, and it's something I suddenly, when talking about it with my book group, I was like, this just seems important as a theme he addresses again and again, and it touches on it here, the idea of the eternal hero, Arthur, the once and future king, and many other themes that come out in the book. It's incredibly thought-provoking for a 279 page book. It is something that I think Wolfe is a specialist at. Is I read his books and I come away and I do not stop thinking about them ever, really. But it also works at the level of just entertainment. There are a couple of critiques, either to kind of consider and reject or to accept. And I want to there's a couple, especially if you're reading non-spoiler reviews, generally speaking, that I thought were interesting in terms of, it is good to think that Wolfe generally does stuff for reasons. Not that he couldn't make a mistake, but there's, you can assume things. And a big thing is there's a lot of female characters. And that's the problem. There's lots of female characters, and most of them have very ordinary names, ordinary American names, fairly similar American names, and it's easy to become confused amongst many of them. You have to take a moment to just recall the relationships. And that's interesting. I think that's it seems to me almost obviously intentional. So I didn't see that as a problem. It's something that I did trip up over, but then that is the kind of knotty bit which forces you, to think deeper. I think there's some stuff about the plot itself is not particularly hard to follow the main beats of, even if a lot of the interesting depths are not quickly apparent. I think there's throwaway lines and descriptions which, when you realise what it's saying about this world, is pretty incredible. I think there's there is a problem probably with the pacing at the end, and what I mean is, what I read several non-spoiler reviews say was, I wish it had 50 pages more. It feels like it's been cut short. And basically the end comes up very quickly. The mystery is being unveiled, and I think it's unveiled fairly well, and then there's some, the conclusion stuff, and then it ends. The conclusion stuff is short. It's, a chapter or so. And I mean a particular kind of conclusion, without spoiling, particular kind of, okay, this is this. And I think there could be a defence that goes, Wolfe meant this, and you have to think about why. That is completely fair, as in that might be intentional and there might be something worth thinking about. But just in terms of normal catharsis, reading a book and expecting, when it sets up and promises a bunch of stuff, that you get that paid off in a way that feels commensurate. And if it doesn't, I think you're just allowed to say, I wish I had. So I think there feels to me like a very, very, and it may well be, it's also possible that Wolfe just didn't quite perfectly execute the ending. The ending is solid, it's interesting, it's short, and you are left with questions you have to pick out, partly just as technical things, not as big mysteries, but just because you're like, oh, wait a second, what happened? So there we are. That's the substantive criticism. I think another criticism is about how a few characters act and behave at different points in ways that seem weird or unreasonable, and there's no reflection of that in the book. Again, given that the examples people give are genuinely weird and unreasonable, I just take that to be on purpose. And I've thought about that, and I will keep thinking about it. I think this is a a really interesting Wolfe book. I think it is. It's not a bad starting place, but a bit like Pandora by Holly Hollander, I fear that if you said to someone, "Oh, this is an easy Wolfe book, just read it," it's quiet enough and subtle enough and small enough that I think that a reader might gloss over it or go over it and be like, "Oh, I kind of enjoyed it. I was a bit confused. What's going on?" You don't get that with Book of the New Sun. I think people might be horrendously alienated by it, but they're not going to think, "Oh, okay, it was fine. I don't know why people think there's so much going on." And it's not like Fifth Head of Cerberus, often recommended as a first Wolfe novel, which things are revealed in that book. You realise, like, the mysteries are put out there and say, "Look, here are some mysteries. Think about it." And I think Castleview, like Pandora, doesn't do it. And I think it leads even Wolfians to go for, like, what is the mystery here? What's the question here? I don't get it. With Pandora, and I got in trouble last time by saying I don't think the murder mystery is even the real mystery of that book. Many people think it is. But, you know, with these subtler books, quieter books, there is just a degree of... it's over accessible in a way that is misleading. One fears as a starter. I think you could read this as a first Wolfe and really enjoy it. You know, I don't think there's any reason not to. But with that caveat, that you know, it's subtle. It's a standalone, which is actually maybe another, much like for Fifth Head of Cerberus or Sorcerer's House, I see recommended as a starter. It's a standalone, so maybe that's something good as well, as you can read it and just say, "I enjoyed that. You know, I'm up for something else now." It was powerful and clever and challenging and easy to read, bouncy, exciting. Also, you know, like some of the novels of the same type in the same era, leaves you, for good or for bad, slightly wrong-footed and needing to step back a little bit. Yeah, I recommend it. I recommend it, especially for Wolfians. I think some people, you know, some Wolfe fans really don't like it, but I think it's a straight-up good novel. And I think for non-Wolfe fans, as I say, you could start with it, or if you don't start with it, you could move on to it pretty quickly. That's my thoughts on Castleview. I enjoyed it a great deal. If you have read it, I'd love to know what you think in the comments. Tell me about what you think about the mysteries and the cleverest things. I also do recommend Mark Aramini's essay on it in his second collection. Anyway, I will see you next time.